Well, hello, everybody. This is David Madison, and I'm joined this evening by Mary Catherine Duffy. Mary Catherine, hello,
Hello, everyone.
and welcome to the webinar this evening. This is going to be the budgeting process, and then the second half, we're going to look at a dashboard for historical financial data. So I think you're going to find that to be a very helpful tool. So that's how we'll divide our time today. First half will be the budgeting process in general. Second half will be what are the important elements of a financial dashboard and what are the different data points you need to create a financial dashboard. So I'm looking forward to our time together tonight. Let's go ahead and take the Q&A box for a spin, if you would. The way that you can ask questions throughout our time together is by punching the Q&A button, which probably is below at the bottom of your screen. And then you can type in a question and that will go to both me and Mary Catherine, and then we will take a look at that and respond to it. So let's take that for a test drive. If you would click on the Q&A button and let us know what city you are joining us from. And that way we will know that the Q&A box is working. And it is working. We've got cities that are coming through. So welcome, everybody.
Great.
It's good to see everyone here this evening. And with that, let's just jump right in. I'm going to turn it over. Mary Catherine's going to lead the first half of the webinar, then I'll lead the second half of the webinar this evening. So Mary Catherine, with that, it is all yours.
Well, thanks. And thanks everyone for being here. I know that it's a lot to come out on an evening. And so we're glad you're here and we're excited to talk about such an important topic. This information is so critical to schools. And it's really critical that people learn how to budget, learn how to look at their financials. And so we're going to be doing a lot of that tonight. And we're excited to have some conversation about how to do some sound budget planning. So I want to start just kind of talk to you about what we're going to be talking about tonight and give you a little agenda before we begin. So we've got four areas that we're going to look at. First, timing is everything. We're going to be talking about why it's important to set a budgeting calendar, have a calendar that gives you a timeline of what tasks you need to be doing as you begin your budgeting and when you need to be doing those. Also, just talking about the goals of good planning. What does it look like to be to do good planning? What things do you need to take into consideration? The third is just things what not to do. What are things that practices that people do that really do not work, so that you can avoid those. And then finally, we're going to talk about the 6 steps for sound budgeting. So let's just jump right in and let's begin with a calendar. So one of the things that I did for a long time at St. Albans, did not do for a long time at St. Albans, is follow a calendar. And I was grateful to a couple of colleagues who taught me this. Just the idea of setting down the tasks of budgeting throughout your year and when you do those. And the truth is that we think when we begin the school year that we're ready to go. We just approved a preliminary budget and we're ready to go, or a final budget and we're ready to go. And all of a sudden in September, October, we're talking about the next year. And I know that that's true for not just budgeting, but all aspects of school life. We're always having one eye on the day and one eye going forward. And so that's no different for budgeting. And so we're going to start in looking at what should we be doing in September and October. September and October is really the time for us to begin to gather information, to review previous and current year budgets, to begin to assess enrollment trends and establish a conservative enrollment goal for the coming year. So not only are we, as we have new students in September, are we working on bringing families into our schools and getting everybody back to in the back to school mode. We're also taking a look at what we've got coming forward and looking at what our enrollment is today and what do we think it's going to be going forward. So and we do that because we want to set a preliminary budget for the purpose of setting tuition for the coming year. That is, setting tuition early is critical for a school because we're going to get out there and market that information. So we really have to begin this process early. The other reason that it's really important is because it takes time. It takes it takes energy to put together a budget, and we're doing it among all the other things that we do as school heads and as administrators and treasurers, and so it just takes time to gather all that information. So that's why we want to start in September and go into October. So once we hit September and October, we've been gathering information. Then we begin to have meetings kind of with our finance committee. As a head of school, I would begin the process really by working first with my business manager, and we would talk through, gather information, gather data for enrollment, gather kind of what we've done in the past, what do we think we're going to need in the future, gather all that information, and then we meet with the finance committee. And that committee, that group of people are kind of responsible for working together to really create the bones of a budget that allow for us to look at what our tuition might be, as well as what our teacher increases might be, what our compensation. Those are typically the two biggest components, and that's what we're going to be talking about in November. We want to set that tuition in December. When I first started at St. Albans, we rarely set tuition in December. We did it in January, and it was almost always kind of we came back in January and it was quick, and we weren't prepared as we would like to be. And so when we started this process earlier and we set tuition in December, it made all the difference in the world into what January kind of looked like as we went forward. So using that budget, putting it together in November, working with the finance committee, that's what you're going to be doing in November. And then in December, the finance committee presents a tuition recommendation to the board, and that board approves the recommendation for tuition for the coming year. Some people would say, well, why December? And what I always say is that it takes time for us to put together marketing collateral and tuition rate sheets. And the truth is that many schools, I would say probably not St. Albans, we didn't see as much traffic in December as we did in January, but many schools are seeing a lot of traffic for new students and lots of open houses and people coming in November and December to look at their school for the following year. So having tuition rates set in December and having the board already have done that is really helpful for the admissions department, for marketing people, for anybody who's going to be prepping for re-enrollment. And then we take a nice Christmas break because we're going to be coming back in January and we're going to hit the ground running. When you hit the ground running in January, what you're going to be focusing on in January and February are two things. You're going to be focusing on re-enrolling your current students and marketing for new students. And so having had that tuition be set in December, now you have your rates in order, and you have the ability to put together marketing collateral and give tours and give tuition rates on your website and all of that information that people are going to be asking for. It's also really helpful if you do open houses in January and February. It goes in the packets. When we, at St. Albans, we would usually do re-enrollment about mid-February. And so we were preparing all the packets to go home for re-enrollment, and that information would go in those packets. And that really, really did help us with the people that were preparing and distributing that marketing collateral. It really helped to have that stuff when we started in January.
Mary Catherine, any thoughts or any advice on how to market the tuition increase? So part of the conversation when you roll out that tuition number is how are you explaining the story behind that? What's right. The narrative behind the tuition increase? Any thoughts on how best to communicate that?
You know, that's really it's a great question, because I feel like I did a lot of the years that I did it, I didn't do it well, and then many of the years I did. And what I think is not what you don't want to do is be silent. I think the more transparent you are with your community about what you're doing and why you're doing it, the easier it is for the community to buy. And so we would, oftentimes I would craft a letter And it was a letter that was usually signed by me and the board chair, and it outlined what the tuition was going to be, why we felt that was important. There were a couple of years where we raised tuition significantly. And when we did that, we literally had meetings where we did a presentation and the board was there, and I usually presented kind of a PowerPoint that outlined what it is we were doing and why we were doing it. And I found that the years that I was super intentional about communicating that, those were the years that we didn't have a lot of pushback. But the years in where we just threw in the tuition rate and we put it in the packet and we moved on, we tended to have some pushback. And so my advice is to be communicating and transparent.
And it's all about how you're describing the value proposition.
Exactly. Exactly.
You know, tuition increases, even large tuition increases, don't necessarily need to be something that scare you, so long as you are able to demonstrate the value. If you're able to demonstrate the value and what how this is going to improve or continue the awesome experience that your student is having, then you're going to be fine. But like you said, I think it's when you don't communicate or when you fail to connect the dots on how this 3%, 4%, 5% increase is going to translate to perceived value. That's where you get in trouble. I have a couple questions here. What percentage of increase would you say is a significant versus a typical for tuition? So I don't have the numbers for this year because we're still getting our annual reports in, but the previous year, 3% was about the average for tuition increases among our schools, with the range being everywhere from 0, no tuition increase, which should scare everybody. It scares me a lot, should scare everybody, to, double-digit increases. But the average, and again, I don't have the numbers for this year yet because we're still waiting for annual reports, but the average seems to be about 3% for our schools. It always hovers up and down by maybe a tenth of a percentage, but around 3. What months did you typically hold these meetings, Mary Catherine? I suspect you held them in January. Is that right, or was it?
Yes, it was usually January because we did our tuition increase in December, and that was once the key is to do the meetings when you're rolling out the information, and so we would roll out the information and then have those meetings. Again, I feel like that it's the year that we did a 10% increase in tuition was the year that we gave a significant pay raise to our teachers. And I can almost promise you that I don't think that we had anybody leave the school over that. I mean, they may have moved, but we didn't have anybody that after we communicated properly about why we were raising the tuition, and it was a pretty significant increase, people were in for that. They cared about their teachers. They wanted to be a part of having teachers be paid well. And we got great feedback from that. So I would say probably when you roll your information out is when you're going to give the information. So back to the slide, as we begin to do the marketing, we're also monitoring re-enrollment, and we're current year budgets. We're looking at our budget. We're looking at kind of the preliminary budget that we talked about back in December. And we're working kind of slowly at this point because really you can't do a lot in February because you're waiting for re-enrollment. So the budget's a little bit on hold as you wait for those re-enrollment numbers to come back. We usually had a good number to work with by spring break. And it's really important that as you are working those re-enrollment numbers that you're thinking about not only the re-enrollment, but the people that have signed up that are on the wait list to be from the public. We had public registration at the end of our re-enrollment period. So we were looking at the re-enrollments and we were looking at the public registrants and to see kind of what our spaces would look like. We're also during this time as administrators, as the head of school primarily, monitoring re-enrollment for staffing needs. This is something we're going to begin to think about as we watch the numbers come in to see, are we going to need more sections? Are we going to need fewer sections? Where are we going to need to be putting our staff? And so that's something that we think about a lot in January, February.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by administration monitoring re-enrollment? Because I think there's a wide range of what we mean by monitoring re-enrollment.
Okay.
One example of monitoring re-enrollment is just kind of sitting back and waiting for information to come to you and waiting for, to see what the numbers look like. There's a more active understanding of what that looks like, and I suspect that's what you're talking about. But tell us a little bit about, what does that look like when you've got, what are you doing? Are you going through your enrollment list and you've got names checked off if they've turned in contracts? Haven't turned re-enrollment contracts in. Then you can give us a little more information about that. I get that question a lot.
Yeah, we were super active at St. Albans about re-enrollment. We were paying attention and listening in January, February to who was, almost inevitably, kids will tell you what they're going to be doing for the next year. And so we were listening actively. We had our teachers listening actively. Once packets went out, we were paying close attention to who was bringing them back. We did a lot of incentives when we send those packets out the first week. If you turn them in the first week, you get your name in a drawing for a month's free tuition, or everybody gets a free uniform pass or something that gets those packets back in. And then the second week, the ones that are slow to come in, I would pick up the phone and check in with those families. St. Albans is not a huge school, and I was actively involved in the admissions. That's not necessarily true of all schools, but even the admissions departments in the bigger schools, they know the families, and they know the ones that are coming and going. And so, yeah, I do mean actively watching the re-enrollment and knowing what we have in the pipeline as far as people that have, in kindergarten was a big area. We would watch who's coming from 4K to kinder, who's not coming, how many spots do we have, how many people do we have left in that process. So that's what I mean by actively monitoring re-enrollment.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any, there's no magic recipe to that. It's just a matter of working the phones, working the emails. Exactly. You're always going to have some families that are going to be slow in turning re-enrollment contracts in. You're always going to have some families that, have a possible work relocation. But the important thing is that you stay very, very active, and you don't just wait to get that information. It's critical that you have that data so you can make staffing decisions sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, sometimes you have to make, a tough staffing decision down the road, but you want to try to get as much data as you can in the January, February months so that you can make those necessary decisions that you've referenced.
Exactly. So basically in March and April, but usually by mid-March, we have all of our re-enrollments in. We have placed our new students, given them enrollment contracts. Those have been turned back in, and we have a good idea of who is coming back and what those real numbers are. So then we put together, we finalize a preliminary budget. That usually includes staffing needs and registered students. So when I would put that together, I felt pretty confident in the numbers, and I felt pretty confident in what my staffing needed to be, so that I was able to then decide, do I need additional sections? How many sections am I going to do? Do I need additional staffing in those sections? So those were March and April was kind of when I did that. Administration prepares staff contracts. For me, that was a critical. I wanted my teachers to be contracted by mid-April. I wanted that to be, because for our community, they wanted to know who the teachers were going to be for the next year, and that helped with getting people to turn their stuff in. So I think that contracting, being able to give out contracts during that time is really important, and having a budget prepared and approved by the board in March allows you to do that. So let's go to the next page. May to July is really a holding period where we are taking a look at at our enrollment. We're watching it, seeing if anybody drops. We're revising based on actual enrollment and actual contracted salaries. So one of the things that we did several years ago at St. Albans that really kind of changed the game for us is we began to really put some teeth on our financial policy, so that if people were going to drop out, we knew it prior to August. And so the way we did that is we had a financial policy that said that you had to pay your tuition in June and July. And if you didn't pay your tuition in June and July, you'd be dropped from the rolls. And that really helped get people to be committed or not. And so we had a kind of a drop dead date of June 10th for people to pay their tuition. And if you were going to pay it up front all year long, the whole year's tuition, then you got a discount if you paid it by that time. And so we had a real good number by mid-June as to who was going to come and who was not. And so we did all of that in May and June and July. And we really continued to monitor and revise. If we had, if by June 15th, we had 10 kids drop in kindergarten, well, we knew, what we needed to do with staffing. And so that really helps with your staffing as well.
So for the families that didn't pay in full, what did they have to pay in the summer, the first installment?
They just had to pay their tuition. At our school, we could pay tuition monthly, and it was June to May. And so they just had to keep up with their tuition payments.
Okay.
But prior to that, we had people who would, you were supposed to pay June and July, but we didn't really have any teeth in our financial policy. And quite frankly, people just went on vacation and didn't pay. And we counted on them, and then they would either show up in June and pay in August and pay, or they would drop and not tell us. And we had already hired teachers. And so this really helped us with staffing to be able to really get a better number, because people are not going to usually pay their tuition in June and July if they're going to drop. So make sense? So that really helped us. So again, in August, once we get actual numbers and actual kids in the seats, then the Finance Committee reviews the revised preliminary budget and presents to the board for adoption. And this budget is based on actual students that showed up. So hopefully if you had planned on 250 in your preliminary budget and you ended up with 275, then you've adjusted your budget and you've gone in and added any additional staff you need or any additional things that you weren't planning to do. And then you get to present that budget in August in a much better budget. So that is the calendar. That's what we, when we want to get started, that's kind of the process by which we're going to get started. And you can see why it's really important to get that budgeting started in September, October, because there's so much that's a part of it. So now let's talk about what we need to think about when we begin our budget planning. There are really 4 goals of budget planning. The first one is transparency. And I think it's really important for everyone to understand, everyone that's involved, in the budgeting process, from board members to the business manager to the head of school, everyone should understand what is an income and what is an expense, and to identify. It shouldn't be that somebody, we talk all the time about that we have board members that may or may not be financially savvy. They may not read, dashboards and financials every day, but they need to understand the budget, and it needs to be in a way that everyone that's has the fiduciary responsibility of managing the budget and approving the budget should get it. And so it should be transparent. The second thing is it should be accurate. As you begin to do budget planning, it's not good to guess or to try to approximate expenses or income. It's really critical that you take the time to get the information and be accurate about it. Again, with timelines, we start early. That's something that you want to do. And then finally, inclusivity. You want to ensure that everyone is involved, from the finance committee to administration, involved in the budgeting process. And then it goes to the board and that they're involved as well. We wouldn't want to have just one person putting together a budget. We do see that sometimes in a school where the treasurer will put it together or the head of school will put it together. And that's That's just not good practice. And it's important that everyone's included in the planning.
The only comment I would make about that is on with regard to accuracy. Yeah, let's not guess and approximate where that's possible. Depending on where you are on the calendar, I think there's always a little bit of guessing with
Yes,
regard to
that's true.
enrollment projections.
Sure, for sure. And so, yeah, when we talk about accuracy, I'm really talking about, take the time to look at what your electric bill has been for the last 5 years, and don't just go, oh,
Exactly.
I think it's this.
Yeah,
So yeah, take the time.
exactly.
So let's talk about what doesn't work in a budgeting practice. Let's save time and let's let the head do it. Because it's a lot of work to get everybody together and to get the people on the finance committee are busy in their own businesses, and let's just let the head put it together. That doesn't work, because again, we want to be inclusive as we put together a budget, and we want all the people who have the responsibility for either administering it or approving it need to be involved in it.
And from the board training perspective, I mean, this is a shared responsibility.
Exactly.
This is not something that that should just be on the head's shoulders. Now, again, obviously the head's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. When we talk about the dashboard later, the head or the head's business officer is really going to be responsible for pulling that together. But you're absolutely right. And as a head, if you feel like you're being pulled into head, you just do all this, question whether or not that's appropriate.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's true. Honestly, it's true of just throwing it to the business manager. That's not appropriate either.
That's
There
true.
should be inclusivity. The second practice that doesn't work is that just tuition first. Figure out what everybody's charging and what the market will bear, and that's what our tuition is. We're going to talk about how to create the budget, but this is not the best approach, because you want to try to figure out, you want to solve for your tuition and figure out what it is that you need to run your program. And so kind of just guessing what your tuition should be based on what everybody else is doing is really not a great approach. And then the third approach is inflation, just increasing everything across the board, just 3% across the board. That's not accurate either.
So a few follow-up comments. So yeah, the tuition first piece, I think we see that a lot. We see that a lot where the board just in a vacuum decides we're going to have a 3% tuition increase, and then tells the head, okay, 3% tuition increase, make that work.
Right.
Again, there's always give and take, but if value proposition is the most important thing, then that begins by trying to figure out what do we need to continue the value proposition we have or to improve it, and then we solve for tuition afterwards as opposed to solving for it first.
Correct.
One comment about inflation too. I ran across a really interesting study about the role of inflation in tuition conversations, and it was an economist that was looking at manufacturing industries compared to service industries or industries like education, where they're so based on people.
Mm-hmm.
And what the economists are finding is just an increase based on inflation alone is not sufficient for industries that are so people-based like ours, because the costs that we have, because we have so many people, things like insurance, retirement, all of those things that go along with having so many people on your staff, those are increasing at a rate faster.
That's right. Yes, much higher rate.
And so as a result, school boards that are only increasing by inflation are going in the wrong direction. So you need to absolutely be aware of what the inflation rate is, and also what the local rate is, because that may be very different from the number that you're hearing on CNBC or the news channels, for example. So you need to drill down and figure out what the local cost of living increase is in your community, but then realize that because of the way our schools are structured and we have so many people involved in the program, raising by inflation alone is not going to be sufficient in most cases.
That's a great point. I appreciate that, because I don't think people think that deeply about it. which is kind of the point that we're trying to make in this webinar, is that it takes time and energy to really to develop a budget that's helpful. So let's go on and go.
Good question from a participant I'm going to throw at you if that's okay.
All right.
How common is it to base salary increases and thus tuition to match your competing public school district, i.e. local ISD increases by 3% due to inflation, so on and so on? So our vital sign on comparing salaries with local ISDs is, so long as you are at the 85% or north, greater than 85% of what your local ISD is paying, we think that's a solid position. When the gap between what you're paying and what the local ISD paying is greater than that. So for example, if you're paying only 70% of what the local ISD is paying, that would be a problem. That would indicate not just matching with their increases, but actually doing some catch-up work as well. And MK, you've had some experience with this. So what are your comments on the idea of matching base salary increases of the local ISD?
Yeah, I think that it's critical, and the reality is that once we started doing that, not only were we able to recruit some really fantastic teachers, we were able to keep the teachers that we had, and I think that if nothing else, that vital sign is something that we should all be working towards. Now, whether the idea of, increasing your tuition kind of along those same lines, I don't know that I think that's necessarily a good idea, but I definitely think that when you're looking at the compensation expense, it's critical that you ensure that the teachers that you have are, very close if to that vital sign, that 85% is as close as possible.
And again, we don't think you have to match dollar for dollar, because our experience is that teachers really love working in Episcopal schools. But when the gap is, bigger than 15% of between what you're paying and the local ISD is paying, that's an indication that you're going to have a difficult time attracting and retaining. I'm throwing out ISD. ISD stands for Independent School District. So that's the public school, the local public schools.
Right. All right, well, let's jump into how do we put together a sound budget. So we're going to start first and foremost, we're going to gather our documents. You can't put together a budget without gathering up the information, which is why we start early. And some of the documents that you need to think about looking at when you're preparing your budget is a chart of accounts. You want to know kind of what does our income look like? How many income areas do we have? How many expenses do we have? An income statement and a balance sheet, audited financial statements. If you just do a review, then you would want to see those reviewed financial statements. A financial dashboard, which David is going to talk about in the second hour. This is an absolutely critical component to looking at preparing a budget, because you're looking at your history and you're able to see kind of trends. And so that's really important. And then any interim financial monthly reports that you have. Those are all documents that you want to gather together before you begin. And then we're going to start, and we've got 6 steps. And we're going to start with step 1. And step 1 is to review all of those financial documents that you have put together. When you are looking at creating a budget, you want to look, we just talked about compensation. You want to look at your compensation and you want to ask the question, number 1, are we paying what we need to be paying? Are we getting close? If we're not even close, that's something that we need to consider as we're preparing our budget. We want to look at enrollment and retention. There was a year that and it's easy to miss, but there was a year several years ago when I did not realize how many kids we were losing from 4K to kinder. The public schools had gone from half-day kinder to full-day kinder, and we had always done full-day kinder. And before I knew it, we were struggling to retain students from 4K to kinder. And so it's really important that you be watching kind of what your trends are in those areas. Again, we want to know about faculty and staff headcount. How many sections do we need? How many teaching assistants will we need? Curriculum, will we be buying new curriculum this year? we're constantly updating curriculum, and maybe this is the year for math and next year is the year for history or whatever, but curriculum, athletics, and extracurricular activities, financial aid, operations and maintenance. Did we spend enough on maintenance last year? Did we go over budget? What is our debt? What is the development side? How much can we expect to fundraise? What are our capital expenditures? And finally, looking at the tuition and fees, what is our investment income looking to be? There was a year that we had a couple of endowments, and every year they would tell us what we could expect based on what the market had done. And there was a year where they called us and said, hey, you're probably going to get about $20,000 less this year. And luckily it was early enough that we could review that and put that into our budget for the next year. So these are all really important things that you need to be looking at as you begin to prepare a budget. So that's our step one. Step two is to identify and detail. One of the ways that we do that is by really reviewing all areas of school life in detail. Taking a look at not just the academics, taking a look at our benefits, our compensation packages, taking a look at our facilities. What do we need to be painting? What do we need to be working on? Taking a look at technology. If you review all areas of your school life and you take a look at that, then you can include that in your budget. Second of all, you want to ensure that all areas can be identified in the chart of accounts. This is something that my business manager and I talked about a lot, because I liked having a lot of line items. I thought that it was important to continue to always identify. If we knew we were always going to spend money on, an event that we did every year for our parents, don't just stick that in marketing, but pull that out and go, this is a parent event that we know we're going to spend money on, because it's easy to lose track of what your expenses are. And so I really liked having a line item, as many line items as possible. Now, I can tell you that some treasurers don't like that. Some auditors don't like that. But for me, as the manager of the budget, it was really important to and critical for me to know kind of where things were. I do not like to hide things in miscellaneous. And it's easy to do because sometimes it makes you feel like that you're not going over budget, but the truth is you are. And so the more able you are to identify and detail what your expenses are, the better off you're going to be. So then the next thing we're going to talk about is activity-based accounting. And this is just when you take your expenses and you ensure that you are grouping similar line items together. And so, for example, compensation. Under compensation, you would have salaries for faculty and administrative staff. We always put any employee compensation we put under there. Then you put for benefits, you would do maybe retirement, if you have medical benefits, if you have life insurance or long-term disability, any kind of housing or tuition remission, those are benefits and those would go together. Operations and maintenance would be a great for utilities, maintenance and repairs, renovation and replacements. The more you are able to put together like activities, then the better you're able to kind of discern all areas and not miss something big. And one of the things that I would encourage everyone to consider is that, this is not that different than budgeting in our homes. It's really not. We have a certain amount of income that's coming in, and we know we have a certain amount of expenses, and we need those two to be equal. And so, but we don't say to ourselves at home, oh, I'm probably never going to buy dog food for the dogs. Of course we are. So it just the same way, we can't say, well, we're probably not going to need to buy curriculum ever again in the math department. Obviously we're going to need to buy curriculum. So we need to identify those, find out what the activities are that the school is engaging in, and make arrangements for ensuring that we have covered every single thing in our expense section. The other thing I think that this does is this allows us to see where we're spending money that maybe we don't need to, or maybe where where we think we're spending money and we're not, or where we say we're not spending money and we are. And so I think it allows from some accountability. It allows for us to make sure that the way we're spending our money is actually going to benefit the school. So let's go to the next slide, and we're going to talk about step number 4, which is bottom-up budgeting. As you begin to now you know your expenses. Now you know kind of where everything is in your expense section. We're going to now talk about the questions you should ask as you build your budget. So first off, you want to say, does this activity further the school's mission? If we have a line item, for example, for spending money on something that is not mission appropriate, that question will bring that up. Number 2, is this the right amount of money to spend for this activity? Again, it's absolutely critical that you look back in the past, and if you've had 5 years of data that says your electricity is $60,000 a year, and you say, well, this year we think it'll be 50. That's probably not realistic. And so making sure that you have the right amount of money for the activity, and you can also have too much in a line item. I have gone through and where we every year just said, this is how much we spend on X. And then when I looked back on the data, I found out, gosh, we're not spending near that much. And so that's an area that we're spending too little. Should we be spending more? Should we be spending less? And finally, do we have enough unrestricted cash in reserve to survive a blow? If the answer is no, then we need to start building a cash reserve right away. And I think that this is an area for a lot of schools that's a challenge. Schools that do not have cash reserves are in a very difficult predicament when things go poorly. And it's just important that you have that cash reserve. And if you don't, then you need to be budgeting for it.
And there's a debate as to how much cash you should have on hand. So our vital sign is 120 days cash. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we do the dashboard. ISM is in the camp of 90 days. They feel like if you have 90 days of cash on hand, that's a sufficient amount. So regardless, you need to make sure there's enough unrestricted cash to handle any kind of unexpected thing that may happen.
Right. And so when we talk about bottom-up budgeting, what we're basically doing here is we're starting with expenses. We're starting at the bottom rather than start at the top and say, here's what our tuition is. Now, how do we spend that money? We're starting at the bottom and saying, what does it cost us to run this program? What is it for the mission of this school? What does that cost? And that's what we've done through step 4. So let's talk a little bit about cash. When we talk about unrestricted cash, let's go to the next slide. There's three things to keep in mind, really. The first is just the capital expenditures. I'm not an accountant. I do have some accounting experience, but I have found frustration at times with accounting because there are rules that you have to do under accounting. And one of those rules under GAAP is that capital expenditures are on the balance sheet. They're not on the income statement. But when we use the income statement to generate a budget, it's easy to forget about the capital expenditures that you need to plan for. And most schools do that in the summer. I know St. Albans did that in the summer. So for example, we would we'd be going along thinking, well, we're in great shape. And then we'd go, oh, we've got to replace the carpet, or we've got to put new tile in 3 classrooms, or gosh, we've got some really old air conditioners that are going to go out. And so those are capital expenditures that we needed to prepare for, but they didn't necessarily go in, we didn't use them as a line item in the budget. And one of the things that Rick Kellogg always says is, make sure that whatever system you're using tracks your capital expenditures. He suggests that you mix those on your budget. He says, and this is a quote from him, that the mixing of those two things will offend your auditors, but he prefers that you persevere and do it anyway. One of the ways that we did that is when we put together the budget, we would put those capital expenditures at the bottom. So we would do the whole budget, and then we would get our increase to cash or our decrease to cash or whatever it was going to be. And then we would include the capital expenditures. So in a perfect world, you would have an increase to cash of just of enough money that you were putting some aside for reserves and you were putting some aside to take care of the capital expenditures for that year. But
All right,
that's the way
Catherine,
we did it.
quick question from a participant. Prism accounts, is your Prism, is that always a capital expenditure?
Well, Prism actually isn't necessarily an expenditure. What it is you putting aside money for reserves, and you're putting aside your money for plant replacement, special maintenance. In the St. Albans budget, we had a line item for repairs and maintenance for a certain amount. And so it became a capital expenditure when we knew that that budget item wasn't going to cover it. So for example, if let's say we had $10,000 in the repairs and maintenance account, and we knew that we had to, an air conditioner went out and it was $15,000, and that's going to take up our whole budget, then it becomes a capital expenditure. Does that make sense?
Gotcha.
So for us, that's how we did it. And so when you are talking about a Prism account, that's why it's so important to have it. Prism does not just mean plant replacement, it means reserves, and it means any special maintenance you have to do. So it kind of incorporates all of that.
But that would be on your, not on your balance sheet, but on your financials, correct?
Yes, yes. And then the depreciation, just remember that depreciation is not cash, and it's important. We always included depreciation in our budget. And then, and one of the ways that you can do that is in a perfect world, in a perfect cash situation where everyone paid all of the tuition up front and you had all of your cash there, then it wouldn't be as difficult. But cash flow becomes a problem. At least at St. Albans, it became a problem because we would have a lot of expenditures in the summer, and we would have a lot of money in the summer to pay for a lot of those expenditures. But we would, we'd buy all our curriculum, and we would buy all the things that we needed to get the school year started, but not everybody was paying up front. And so that was when you'd get to December and cash flow would be a little bit tricky because of that.
So we've got a follow-up question from Lisa. I'm actually going to turn Lisa's mic on to make sure that we're getting her question right. So let me turn Lisa's mic on. Lisa, can you hear us?
Looks like she's got it's muted.
Oh, sorry. Try.
I think
you're on, Lisa. Sorry about that. We were kind of like with the car lock on the door. We were unlocking and locking each other at the same time. Sorry about that, but I think you're on now.
Yeah, I just don't understand Prism all that much, frankly, because when you said that can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. When you said that you could, you were, if you had unexpected repairs to air conditioner, etc., that were over what you had budgeted, then you would capitalize that. Well, not under the policies of our personal policies of what we can capitalize. You can't always capitalize a repair. It has to be an improvement and not just a repair of an existing, of something that you already have that you're just repairing, right? So an improvement is different than a repair is kind of what I was asking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, what I would argue is that, I use the example of the air conditioner. When our air conditioners were super, super expensive, they would be way out of they would become a capital expense because they were, but they might go out in the middle of the year. And so I think, usually our accountants would help us determine if something's going to get capitalized or not. But the Prism account, does that make sense? So I'm not talking about like painting.
If you have old carpet and you spend, even you can spend a lot of money on replacing carpet, for instance, but you can't capitalize that because it's not an improvement. It's just a repair,
it's a replacement, right?
Yeah, of what you've already got.
I think you make a really good point. I think it completely depends on the specifics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right.
I just want to understand more about Prism, and we don't. I don't think, we don't really have a prism reserve, for instance, but we do budget for capital expenditures that are not on the, on the P&L, or on the,
Right.
statement of activity, for instance. But so I just want to understand more about that if I can. But anyway, thank you for answering my question. So,
You bet.
You bet. Okay, so let's see,
Okay.
Mary Catherine, are we on the next slide?
So
Or?
yeah, let's go to the next slide. So
Perfect.
after we have determined all of our expenses, now we're going to solve for tuition. And this is a challenge for a lot of people. They don't, again, a lot of us have wanted, and I'm included in this, to say, well, here's the tuition. Now let's fit our expenses in. But Rick Kellogg has really taught me that it's really the step 5 is to solve for tuition last. You've looked at your expenses. Now you're going to move to the income side, and you're going to make sure that you throw in your fees, any other extra income that's not tuition, and then you solve for the tuition rate that makes your budget break even. And we know that that's going to be a big number probably. That makes people nervous, and it's likely that they're going to be going, there's no way. Well, we know that. So that's why we go to step 6. And when you think about that tuition, what we're trying to get you to think about is, what does it cost to run our program, and what do we need to be charging our families? And that is why you want to do it the way we're suggesting. Once you see that tuition is a number that maybe you can't charge, then here are some things that you do. Number 1, you go back and look at your expenses. For me, makes so much sense because this is what I would do in my daily life. I'm a dreamer, and I really like to sit down and write down every single thing that I want to spend money on. I would rather have all the expenses laid out there, and this is what I want to spend the money on. This is what the curriculum we need. This is the staffing we would like. And then we find out that that's way probably out of range, and because the tuition is too high that we need. And so then we go back and we begin to make adjustments. But what focusing on expenses first does is it allows the school to better develop a blueprint for allocating resources in a mission appropriate way. What that means is that you have to really look at your expenses, and you have to go, what is really necessary and what's not? What is mission appropriate and what's not? That's the reason I really like this approach to budgeting, because it makes you ask the question, do I really need that? And in a nutshell, that's what you're doing, is you're asking the question, do I really need that other pair of black boots? Do I really need to have 2 more sections of this? Or do we really need to buy all the math curriculum that we want? That's what I like about this approach to budgeting. So what you do is you go back to the expenses and you make adjustments. You go back in and go, okay, you know what? We're not going to buy all of the math curriculum. We're only going to buy half the math curriculum this year, and we'll buy the other half next year. Or we're not going to buy 50 iPads. We're going to buy 20 iPads, and we're going to all share them. Once you do that, and then you go back and run the tuition again, and you keep doing it until you get to a place where you can balance your budget to your satisfaction. That's the thing that it does, is that this whole process just really makes you hone in on what matters and what's important. So I want to stop there, and I want to offer you the opportunity to ask questions. And it's a lot of information, and I know that. And one of the reasons that we sent this out early is because we know that it's a lot of information to take in, and we want you to be able to go back and look and see things that maybe you missed or have questions about. And
Mary Catherine, one follow-up question back to the vital sign on faculty salaries. So one of our participants commented that they're at 80% of what the local ISD is paying. So the gap between what they're paying and what the local ISD is paying is 20%. And just wanted to get some opinions on that. The experience is that they have not to date had problems with attracting or retaining faculty. So 2 things come to mind. First, make sure it's apples to apples, because you may actually be closer than you think if you were providing tuition remission
Hmm.
So make sure to take that into consideration in your analysis, because if you're offering, for example, a chunk of tuition to faculty kids, that's a benefit. And so that actually, you may be closer than you think. The other thing is, if it's working for you at 80%, that's awesome. The only reason I'm a little bit nervous is we're concerned that there may be a teacher shortage on the horizon. When we look at the number of undergraduate students that are going into teacher education programs compared to the number of teachers that are going to retire, a lot of the ISDs across the country are anticipating a teacher shortage. So they're preparing for that with salary increases and then also signing bonuses. So we're not seeing that a lot yet, but those are the conversations that are happening in the public school world. And so if we're not as close to that 85% number as possible, that's something we should at least talk about. But in your community, if 80% is working, I don't know if I would, immediately change that to try to get to 85% in 1 year. What are your thoughts, MK?
Yeah, we usually were at about 80%, and that did work for us. And I do think it's has to do with your community. But I think the challenge with 80%, I think you always just have to be on guard about what it is you're doing and paying attention, because when we stuck at 80%, there were times where we woke up one year and went, oh my gosh, now we're at 75%, because HCISD went straight up and they gave more than we anticipated or whatever. So you just have to really watch it. And I also think that I agree with you, David, about this idea of teacher shortages. We have to be prepared that we're going to be competing harder in the future for the same people. And we can't just assume that they'll love teaching at the Episcopal school and that they'll take whatever. We can't assume that. So we have to be prepared for that. Great question.
Okay, well, gang, we are at the top of the hour. So let's do this. Let's take a 5-minute break. And then at 5 minutes past the hour, let's say that, we will start the second unit, which is going to focus on the financial dashboard. So we'll take a quick break and be right back.